Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We carry on with ayat 233 of Surah al-Baqara. After having in the previous ayats, and some of that continues in the ayats we're going to do, having dealt with issues of divorce, and the whole section, of course, dealing with marriage, divorce, and in this case now with children and custody for the children and so on. So in ayat 233, Allah says, mothers should breastfeed their children 2 full years if they wish to complete the breastfeeding, and the father is responsible for their adequate feeding and clothing. No soul shall be burdened beyond her capacity, and neither should a mother come to harm on account of her child, nor a father on account of his child. And the same goes for the heir. But if both decide in mutual agreement and consultation to wean the child, it is no sin on them. And if you decide to give your children away to be breastfed, it is no sin upon you if you pay properly what you promised. And be aware of Allah and know that Allah sees what you do. Quite a long ayat, and quite a number of things in there. First of all, a encouragement, but not a strict requirement to breastfeed children for, well, as long as possible. Here the limit is set as at 2 full years. That is the limit for breastfeeding. It shouldn't be done beyond that. There is no lower limit because Allah doesn't oblige it upon women to breastfeed, but recommends it. And at that time puts the obligation for the feeding and clothing, and that means feeding and clothing of the woman, not the child. Yeah, upon the father. So because the mother is busy in bringing up the child, the father has an obligation to cater and provide for her. Seems a simple and banal statement, but it's quite important because if you look at our society now, you find that a lot of issues surround this whole idea of who does what in a family and who gets, I mean, you could bring in maternity leave in here. So strictly speaking, maternity leave in Islam is 2 years if you want to go by this, or that is the limit of what somebody should be able to apply for. You can bring the issue of entitlement for being looked after. And we come to some of that in the following ayats as well. And that this is a choice of women they have, it's a right they have, effectively, because it's not placed as an obligation, so it's a right they have to breastfeed their children rather than to be asked to do anything else. And this requirement to provide in turn is qualified by the statement that no soul shall be burdened beyond capacity. So of course, whilst the father is responsible to look after the needs of the mother and the child, that has to be in line with his means. So if somebody affords more, is of a higher living standard, then they have to afford more, and if they of a lower living standard, then less is asked of them. So that is according to status in many ways, and that principle applies, of course, not just in this particular case, because many statements in the Qur'an, whilst they have a specific or particular relevance, also have a more general application, and this principle that nobody should be burdened beyond what they are capable of applies to the degree that if a father couldn't pay, then it would be obligatory for the Baitul Mal, for the state to step in. Again, a concept that in modern society we're familiar with, the idea of child benefit and things like that. But these concepts were novel at the time. And Islam establishes these basic rights that people have towards each other, but also that if somebody has a right against somebody and that other one can't fulfill, then it must be met by other means, because nobody should be broken by having to discharge their duty. And therefore it is stated clearly again that neither should a mother come to harm on account of her child, nor a father on account of his child. So, whilst the welfare of the child is paramount in these regulations, it should not be at the expense of the parents that they come to harm. A lot of people try and do the best for their children and overburden themselves to a degree that they can't handle it. You see people, let's say, working away, double shifts or whatever, just to afford a particular education for their child. It is not something Islam recommends. Allah says that they shouldn't take harm on account of their child. They should do the best for their child within their means. They should not come to harm. Of course, in a specific issue like breastfeeding, if a mother is not able to do it or takes harm from it, then it has to be stopped, and she shouldn't be asked to continue. Likewise, a father shouldn't be made to suffer on account of his child. And Allah adds to this here also that the same goes for the heir, which means, of course, if the father dies, there are many ways of linking this last bit. You can link it to the need to provide for the woman, that if the father dies, then whoever inherits from him needs to also, his heir needs to also provide for the woman whilst she is looking after the child. But that, if that was the case, would actually be abrogated by the general ayats about inheritance, because the woman herself inherits, so she is now taken care of. Some say, well, no, it's not a mansukh ayat. This same goes for the heir, that also he should not be made to suffer on account of his child, of the child. So there comes now, of course, in the various literature on tafsir, quite a lengthy discussion of who is to look after the child if the father dies or is not around. Who does the child belong to? And also, who does the child go to if there is a divorce? Because this whole thing still is in the context of marriage and divorce. And this ayat is partly used to also say that the child, particularly when young, naturally belongs to the mother. The father's family need not be burdened with it. It belongs to the mother because the mother still needs to breastfeed and so on. When the child is old enough, and that is, of course, is taken from a number of hadiths, then the child should be asked and has a choice whom to go with in the case of a divorce. But in the case of the father dying, that the child actually goes to the mother and her family initially. And there are, of course, various differing opinions on that issue as well. And I don't really want to go into the detail of everything, but just to be aware that each little phrase or part of a phrase even has a whole spin-off of discussions that then form the basis of various rulings in fiqh of what should happen in this case or in that case. And this instruction about breastfeeding is clarified once more by saying that if both decide in mutual agreement and consultation to wean the child, then it is no sin on them. Now, the interesting aspect in this particular one is not just to say that there is not necessarily a need to complete the 2 years, but to say that this is up to both parents to agree upon. If they want alternative arrangements, then it's for them to agree upon that. And again, one deducts in many ways further and says parents have the right to bring up their children or cater for their children the way they see fit, provided they agree upon it and consult each other about it. So you can't run a family dictatorially by one partner saying this is what we're going to do with the child, or the other partner saying no, this is what we're going to do with the child. They have to agree upon it. It has to be something that is talked through and then resolved mutually. The whole issue of consultation, that of course in a society takes place in a larger aspect, and we have in Surah Shura about consultation, but here specifically in the family, parents are requested or asked or required to consult with each other about what they do with the child, and are encouraged to reach mutual agreement. And there is no sin upon them in what they result in that. So they have a certain quite generous amount of freedom and leeway with regard to the upbringing of their child. But here, of course, the specific meaning relates to the breastfeeding, that it can be stopped earlier in a case where both agree, and also, which is followed by the next part, that if they decide to give the children away for breastfeeding, that is, that they get a wet nurse. Of course, we got to realize that we're talking about a time where baby milk, powdered baby milk, was a non-entity. So now you would say, rather than giving them away to a wet nurse, you put them on the bottle. But that was not an option in those days. So if for some reason the mother did not wish to continue to breastfeed or couldn't do so, then an alternative had to be found, and that had to be a wet nurse. And of course, in that case, it has to be done on behalf of the parents, and they have to pay for it. It becomes a service that needs to be reimbursed. So Allah says, provided if you pay properly what you promised for it. So you have to keep to that commitment. Once you commit yourself to somebody else feeding the child, then you have to pay for that. Some say for the whole term. Even if later you say, well, we're going to stop the arrangement because it's no longer necessary, but if you got a wet nurse to look after the child for the remaining period of those 2 years, then that of course could lead us on to employment law. If you contract somebody for a particular period of time and then you don't need the services anymore, you may still be required to pay the services until that specified time runs out, because they freed themselves for that purpose and may not be able to cover their livelihood in any other way. And you can see how these things can branch off. You could, of course, in again the modern context, whilst not requiring the services of a wet nurse necessarily, you could obviously draw parallels with using a childminder or nursery or something, and similar principles would apply. And the final statement in this ayat is to be aware of Allah and to know that Allah sees what you do. A general reminder that we have frequently, of course, in the Qur'an, in a way telling us that when Allah lays down rules or laws, then they shouldn't just be followed to a particular specific detailed instruction, but actually they should be done in the understanding that there is an objective to be met, and that whatever you do should be in line with the meaning and the sense and the purpose of those rules. And you shouldn't just try and abide by the letter of the law and forget the principle, because Allah does see what you do, He's aware of what you do, and we ought to be aware of that. Which is very important, particularly when Allah gives room for consultation, for leeway, for changing specific rules. When He doesn't tie us down, then we shouldn't take advantage of that, but do it in a spirit of awareness of Allah and wanting to meet the best objective. Yes, so nobody should be harmed by this or that arrangement, but nobody either should try and wiggle out of it claiming that he would be harmed otherwise when he isn't. And that is very important, particularly in the divorce context again, and we come to some of that in a moment, because so much fighting goes on once a divorce takes place over who pays what. So much quarrels about children, who has the custody, but not so much only the custody, but also who has to pay for the maintenance for the child. And people try and avoid their responsibilities even if they are capable of meeting them, and people on the other hand trying to get something out of them even if they can't, and so on and so forth. So to really avoid that kind of attitude, there is this final warning at the end of this ayat. And we move on to ayat 234, that has to do with the waiting period for a widow. Allah says, and if I wait 4 months and 10 days, then when they have reached the end of their waiting period, there is no sin upon you in what they do with themselves within the rules, and Allah is informed of what you do. So here Allah establishes the period of mourning for a wife in excess of the general period of mourning for anybody else that does not exceed 3 days. The official mourning for any death does not exceed 3 days. But in the case of a wife mourning for the death of her husband, her mourning lasts for 4 months and 10 days. And I'll come back to that because there is also some questions of where does she stay and what entitlements does she have. But for that period of 4 months and 10 days, she is not to remarry. There are disputes about whether she should wear particular clothes or avoid particular, like colorful clothes, avoid any perfume or kohl or makeup or whatever. And in some say, well, that's totally irrelevant anyway because she should only wear it for her husband and he's died. But generally there are questions about that. It certainly is not specifically in any way covered by the ayat, nor does the ayat specify where she should pass that mourning period, whether in the same house or whether she can go somewhere else. It simply states that she needs to wait before continuing a normal life and also being eligible for remarriage if she wishes so. She needs to wait those 4 months and 10 days. That is the mourning period. And after that, when they have reached the end of that, then they are free to do what they want within the rules. That means, of course, any general limitations that apply on women apply, or in any situations, but they are then in charge of themselves. But until then, they need to wait with making any specific arrangements, particularly with regard to remarriage. And this Allah is informed of what you do is a reminder that one needs to stick to that and not just kind of pretend to do it or by the letter, because He knows whether you abide by it or not. As I said, I'll come back to that in a moment with one of the following ayats, because that refers back to it, and the question whether this ayat abrogates one that is to come. But the waiting period, just as a add-on, of course, for the woman whose husband dies, is different from the waiting period for the divorced woman. where it is 3 cycles. And so this waiting period has nothing to do with whether she is pregnant or has a child or something. This waiting period is for mourning, and it has to do with the idea that the ruh of the deceased will have finally departed after that period of time. And again, I can't really go into it right now, but the idea is that the ruh has the permission to still remain some way in contact for that period of time. And you will find that when people die, often to those who are close of them, they come and visit them sometimes in their dreams after they have died, to comfort them and tell them that they're okay or so. Particularly in a short time after the death, there is a greater likelihood of that. But as this time passes, then the ruh moves on into the next stage. So it has more to do with that rather than anything else. In ayah 235, Allah says, "It is no sin for you to declare a proposal to women or keep it to yourselves. Allah knows that you think of them, but you must not date them secretly and only say what is appropriate, and you must not decide a marriage contract until after the completion of the obligation," meaning the waiting period. "Know that Allah knows what is within you, so keep Him in mind and know that Allah is forgiving and patient." This again has general and specific meanings. Here, of course, it is in the context of making a proposal to a woman who either has been divorced or has been widowed and therefore becomes available. But of course, it is also a general statement that there is no harm in actually approaching a woman and proposing. And again, it has to do with a lot of the habits of society at the time, where in many ways it was thought inappropriate to do that. Particularly, it was thought inappropriate after a previous marriage had, either through death or divorce, just been dissolved. And what Allah says here, that if you have an intention or plans or a proposal, you may communicate that, or you can wait. There is no harm in communicating it also during that waiting period. But you cannot take a decision at that time. You cannot agree on a marriage until that time has lapsed or expired. You can certainly talk about it, and of course that talk has to be of an appropriate way. It has to be decent and proper and within the general rules of how to talk to each other, and in open rather than secretly. There has to be no secret dating or things like that. But whilst you can talk about the future, you cannot decide upon the future until the woman has completed that time and is able to then take a decision about herself. And again, Allah knows what is within you. He knows what feelings, what thoughts you have, so you also be aware of Him. And He's forgiving and patient is a reference to Him also being aware, of course, of our weaknesses, and that no matter how much people would like to say, well, I'm going to give this time, I'm not going to say anything or broach anything, it is sometimes not possible for people to control their feelings in that way, and not to put it across that there is a possible interest. We then return to the issue of divorce and a specific case within it, where in ayat 236 Allah says, "It is no sin for you to divorce women whom you have not touched or not yet declared a dowry for them, but give them a gift, the well-to-do according to his means, and the constrained according to his means, a gift out of decency, an obligation for those who do good." So here we're talking about the specific case of a marriage that breaks up before it has been consummated. So touched here, of course, relates to intercourse, not a handshake or something, but it is worded more gently in the ayat. But that's what is intended, and that a divorce in that case is different from a divorce after people have been married properly. We know that a divorce is the most hateful of the permitted, but in this case where people think they've made a mistake, then that doesn't quite apply. It's not of the same gravity, it's no sin, it's not a problem really. Certainly, of course, and there also one has to bear in mind that this does not diminish the ayat that we had looked at in the last session, that if a woman is divorced and if a man divorces a woman and wants to remarry her, he can't do so until she herself has been remarried. And that, of course, is not permissible to just make that a marriage contract, but it has to be a proper marriage. That is not in any way diminished by this ayat. So you can't apply that in that case and say, yeah, well, married and divorced before consummation, because that has to be consummated. But or it doesn't qualify for that exception. But generally, if people agree on a marriage and then come to the conclusion that it's not going to work for whatever reason, or they feel it's been based on some assumptions or information that turns out to be different, then there is no harm in annulling that, particularly when they haven't even agreed on the terms. Because if the dowry hasn't been declared, that means the terms of the marriage haven't even been agreed. So really, in this particular ayat, and the next one deals with the next stage, in this ayat we're only dealing with the breakup of an engagement. You could really call it that. But they still require to give them a gift. So if you do something like that, you should normally do it in the nicest possible way. You shouldn't just phone up and say, sorry, it's off.
Here's a tenner.
Well, the gift, here's a tenner, the well-to-do according to his means and the constrained according to his means. So if somebody, is well-to-do, then a tenner might not be the appropriate gift. And if somebody hasn't got much, then, well, any gesture, the whole idea, it's called a gift out of decency. The whole idea, and Allah makes an obligation for those who do good, is that you alleviate the bad feeling by it. Almost like saying to the person, it's not really something to offend you personally.
It's not going to work out.
It's not going to work, and there are reasons, and so yes, we break that up, but that doesn't mean, an offense against the person herself being not suitable or something, and the gift has to be some kind of appreciation of the situation, of the hurt that may have been caused, and so on and so forth. A lot of people, just ignore this totally. If they pull out, they pull out and don't speak to anybody ever again. Yeah, it's not really. And then we have the Next ayat 237, where we have gone beyond the just engagement and actually have a marriage contract. Allah says, and if you divorce women before you have touched them, but have already declared a dowry for them. So we have a marriage contract, we have arranged the details, but it has not been consummated. Then pay half of what you have declared. Half the dowry is then payable, unless they or the one in charge of the marriage arrangements lets you off, and it is closer to God consciousness that you should give it up. And do not forget to be generous amongst yourselves, for Allah sees what you do. Now you get half the amount payable, because it's already much more serious. Even so, it hasn't gone through with it. And also probably a recognition that there is cost involved. Because once you make arrangements, people prepare for it. Whether it's buying dresses or whatever, I mean, there is costs involved, and that needs to be compensated for. But there is the opportunity to waive that, and it says either they, that is the women, it's in plural here because it's in all cases. He can hardly be the one who gives away the bride's right to half her dowry. That wouldn't be quite fair. So most really are of the opinion that the one who is in charge of the marriage arrangements means the bridegroom himself. So in other words, it's a mutual thing. Both parties can say, well, forgive it. So the bride can say, okay, I don't want my share, or the bridegroom can say, you get the full dowry, don't worry. Yeah. So both are encouraged to be generous. And this is described as being closer to God consciousness, closer to taqwa. That's what they do, that they give it up. And people are encouraged to be generous because Allah is watching. So again, we are in a stage of negotiations that are more serious. The effects are felt more seriously, and people are meant to be as generous as possible to feeling. We then have two ayats here that deal with prayer before we once more get back to the issue of maintenance both for divorcees and widows. So first of all in 2:3-8, Allah says, keep up the prayers, especially the middle prayer, and stand humbly before Allah. Now that may be a short ayat, but it causes a lot of problems for the Mufassirin, because keeping up prayers is not the problem. That's the middle one. The middle one is the problem. Which is the middle prayer? And every prayer of the Fard prayers qualifies. It does, yes, all of them. Because if you run through them, okay, a lot of people say it's the Asr prayer. Yeah? Because the Asr prayer is in the middle of two daytime and two nighttime prayers. Yeah, it's also in the middle of the day, but it has two daytime prayers before it and two nighttime prayers after it. The Maghreb Prayer qualifies because, yeah, of course the Maghreb Prayer qualifies. Yeah. Well, that depends how you where the day begins, but it qualifies because it is at the turn of day and night. It is the one prayer that isn't shortened, and it's the middle between the one that is short and the one that is long. Yeah. So there is 2 rakah prayers and there is 4 rakah prayers. The Maghrib is 3, which is the middle one between them. You're laughing, but you find that as a justification for it being the middle prayer, amongst many others. Isha prayer, the Isha prayer qualifies as the middle prayer. Gosh, what was it in that case? The Isha has on either end it has a reduced prayer, Fajr and Maghrib. Yeah, so it's in the middle of those. So it has Fajr and Zuhr, which is a 2 rakah, 4 rakah, and at the other end it has Maghrib and Asr, which is a 3 rakah, 4 rakah, and it's in the middle of that. Yeah. Well, there you go. It's quite nice how you can. Fajr prayer. Have you been to Fajr yet? No, we haven't had Fajr yet, have we? Or did we start with Fajr?
No, we didn't start.
We started with Asr, yeah. Fajr, yeah. Obviously has the 2 night prayers on one end, and the 2 is the same as with us, in the 2 day prayers. So certainly qualifies in that respect. And Zuhr finally, but that's not the end of it. Zuhr also qualifies because it's the middle of the day. That prayer is on the middle of the day, so by virtue of that alone it qualifies as a middle prayer. But also some say now, and so you get more options, that Fajr and Asr together are the middle prayer, because that's when the angels take the record, interrupt the routine by lifting the record, of deeds, and the angels change. Yeah. Then there are some other combinations of prayers, that also are being suggested, that this and that prayer together are the middle prayer. I can't even remember how the argumentation went. I think Fajr and Maghrib, I think, because they are the 2 that don't get shortened, whereas the others can be, and so on and so forth. And there are many other options I can't even remember, but one of them I think is quite helpful, that says the middle prayer is a non-specified one. Just like Laylatul Qadr, we don't know when it happens. It's just there for emphasis, so you don't miss it. So you've got to keep all your prayers, you don't miss that one. We don't know which one it is. But yeah, it's quite tricky. So there is really no particular specific answer to this one. But certainly it's only the fast prayers are required. And maybe you could even say it's the fast prayer because it's sandwiched between all the other nafila that you might pray. So, you've got lots of options. And nobody dares coming out with a definitive view. But the interpretation is less tricky when it comes to stand humbly before Allah. Of course, standing here describes the general aspect of prayer. We stand in prayer. That doesn't mean that a prayer in sitting for somebody who is ill, for example, or weakened, is not acceptable or permitted, because that is in place of the normal standing. But the standard normal condition for prayer is to stand in prayer. And so that doesn't preclude the sitting. It's just a description of that we stand before Allah. The humbly is the key word here. Now, qunut, which expresses humility, is understood by most people as, in a way, being the justification for that we should not talk during prayer. That prayer has to be different from other things we do in life. So it has to be separate. We have to behave in a different, humble way, so we must seclude ourselves. Even so we stand in congregation, we must seclude ourselves from the mundane, ordinary world, so we can't talk or deal with each other or walk about or do things during prayer, but it has to be a visible show of humility. And then of course we get off from there to the question, well, are there exceptions? For example, let's say somebody is meant to pray Zohar and finishes after 3 rak'ah, and you say to them, oh, you haven't completed your prayer, you still got a rak'ah to do. That of course is talking during prayer, strictly speaking, but the opinion of most fuqaha is that for that purpose it doesn't fall in that category. That's not a problem. So somebody then can complete that rak'ah rather than the whole prayer becoming invalid. I throw these things in simply that you get an idea of how, because you wonder, how do we get the rules, the various rules in the different madhab that we have about what you can or cannot do, and who can justify that this is okay and this isn't okay. And effectively they do refer back to the Qur'an. They often have to do with initially a linguistic understanding of what does this term in the Qur'an mean, and then supported by either the practice of the day or a hadith that explains it further, and so on and so forth, and then maybe some logic deductions. But initially we look at what does this particular word in this grammatical context specifically mean. Ayat in 239, still with the prayer, and if you are in fear, then pray standing or traveling. Then when you are safe, remember Allah, how He taught you what you did not know. This is the reference to the prayer in fear. Now I've said standing. Really the term is walking. But, well, it's something that's difficult to fully put across in a translation. Of course, the idea is not that you pray walking about, because still prayer has to be separate from just, let's say, a dua. We're talking here still about the formal prayer. The idea is prayer is not cancelled even if you fear that somebody, on account of seeing you pray, might punish you, arrest you, talk to you, whatever. So you minimalize the prayer. And so it's not really walking, but you can just stand there. You don't do the moves. You go through it in your mind. And you remain alert of your surrounding to interrupt or cut it short if you have to. So really it's standing still. It's not walking about. But it's not like standing in prayer normally, which includes the ruku and the sujood and all that. It is effectively just standing and mentally going through the prayer rather than physically. And likewise, or traveling. Traveling here really means rikab, that is on your riding animal. So you pray whilst you sit on your horse or camel, or and whilst you're moving. You don't get down for prayer and pray separately. You might be observed and in trouble, so as you're passing through. And of course, your horse or camel is quite happy trotting along whilst you do your prayer. Your car won't, so I don't think one should recommend to do your prayer whilst driving, because, yeah, you could put your cruise control on.
I was going to say, eventually the taxi.
The taxi, yeah. Well, you could put your the cruise control on, but I don't think that's sufficient, you know. Maybe one day when you get these cars that drive themselves along a given path, you know, and find their way to the destination, or keep with cameras a set distance to the car before them or so, maybe then that applies again. But at the moment, I think this ayat is not particularly to be followed in modern means of transport to pray whilst traveling. Well, yeah, on a plane. I mean, as a passenger, also in a car, that's not the problem, you know. As a passenger, that would apply again. But certainly not if you're in charge. Not if you're in charge of the vehicle. But that is what these terms refer to. Walking and riding really means standing and whilst moving, but not moving in that you walk through a market or so, but moving on a means of transport. Then when you are safe, remember Allah, how He told you what you did not know. Meaning, carry on praying as it should be done. Spend more time and be grateful. Remember here means be grateful that He's given you a prayer to pray, and B, ways of making it easier at particularly difficult situations. And there are, of course, again questions which I don't really want to go into of, well, prayer of fear. Is it 2 rak'ah like the shortened prayer of a musafir when you're traveling? Or is it just 1 rak'ah? Or is it the full length of the prayer? What happens when you feel safe and you haven't completed your prayer of fear? Do you cancel it and then do the proper prayer? Or and you know, how do they interlink at that moment where the state of fear? And fear really means where you're in fear of your life, changes to one of safety and so on. But those are open-ended discussions. Then we return once more to the issue of divorce and maintenance and widows and maintenance. Allah says in ayat 240, and if any of you die and leave wives behind, they must leave a provision behind for their wives for a year without forcing them out, meaning out of the home. But if they leave, there is no sin upon you in what they do with themselves within the rules. Allah is mighty and wise. Now here we have an ayat that says that a widowed woman must be given provision from the inheritance, from what the husband leaves behind, for a year. But if they leave the house, then that's not your problem, that's up to them. Now, a lot of people say this ayat is, and I said I'd come back to that, is abrogated by the ayat that we had before, where they must wait 4 months and 10 days. Because, and that the provision is abrogated by the general amount of inheritance that is now given to wives. So one view is this ayat has been replaced by the other ayat that we've already dealt with. But there are people who think that these 2 ayats are complementary. They are complementary in that these people say, well, the first 4 months and 10 days the woman must stay in the house. And for the remainder she can stay up to a year without being asked to leave. But if she goes, that's up to her. And if she stays up to a year in the house, then she is entitled to benefit from whatever is in the house. She is still entitled to that provision, irrespective of what she inherits. So you can see that there is a possible complementary view. But many are of the opinion that these two cancel each other out, that one ayat abrogates the other. And 241, Allah says, and for divorced women must be an appropriate provision. This is an obligation for those who are aware of Allah. Now, here we're talking about maintenance. Not just in the case of somebody dying, but we're also talking about maintenance for divorcees. And whilst Allah doesn't specify the provision, He says an appropriate provision. He makes it an obligation. And He doesn't specify it further that it just applies to some divorcees and not others. With the exemption, of course, here of the earlier case we had of a divorce that, or a marriage that was annulled before being consummated. That is a different story. But a divorcee is entitled to ongoing maintenance. We had the earlier ayat, of course, but that related to the child. Yeah, about the breastfeeding and the payment for that. And in the case of divorce as well, the father has to pay for the child and has to pay for the mother whilst she looks after the child. But here we're talking about irrespective of a child, whether she has a child or she doesn't, that a divorced woman has an entitlement to maintenance until she remarries. If she remarries, or that is the understanding of most fuqaha, and when she remarries, of course, then her new husband is responsible for her keep. But the husband who divorces her, he retains an obligation to make sure that she can survive. Because if you think of it properly, Islam introduces a whole rethink of how women were dealt with in the past. Because she's been married, she is no longer an eligible spinster, as it were, and therefore that marriage has robbed her of her opportunity of finding somebody to provide for her. So even though the husband is no longer wanting to have her as his wife, he still has to ensure her livelihood because he's deprived her of finding a livelihood anywhere else. Until, if she does remarry, then of course that discharges this obligation. So it's an interesting concept and a very revolutionary concept for the time, going well beyond anything that was in practice. And I think it's very important that we realize how Islam has shifted the balance of rights and duties between men and women. Because often we accuse that Islam oppresses women and doesn't give them rights, when in fact it champions the rights of women more than any other ideology has ever done. So that is a very important statement. Appropriate provision, of course, relates again to that according to one's means. It has to be reasonable. And finally Allah says that this is how Allah, in ayah 242, this is how Allah explains His signs for you to consider. So He says He explains them, because He doesn't just give you rules, do this, do that, that's it. But He actually explains it so you can understand what is behind it. So we are asked to reflect more. We're not just meant to abide by them and fulfill them technically, but we actually meant to ponder about them. We meant to deduct principles from them. We meant to see, where is this coming from? What does this mean? We meant to think on those lines. Well, if that is what a husband is required to do, what does that say about the institution of marriage? What does that say about the status of women? What does that say about the rights of children? What kind of arrangement in society have we instituted by these rules and so on? We meant to think a little bit deeper and then act in the spirit of that.